Star Walker Studios presents Dungeon Master's Journey, your multi-dimensional D&D podcast. Hello, fellow gamer. Welcome to episode 276 of Dungeon Master's Journey. I'm your host, Lex Starwalker. On this show, we discuss the craft and the art of dungeon mastering. I've been running RPGs for over 28 years now, and I produce this show in the hopes that you can benefit from my experience, my triumphs, and my mistakes. So today I am returning to my discussion of the Dungeon Master's Guide, and today we're going to start digging into creating a monster. So this is from Chapter 9, the Dungeon Master's Workshop, and I don't know if we'll get through this all today. We'll see. Probably not. I'm guessing at this point this will be a two-parter to get through this section of the DMG because there's a lot here, but we'll see what we can get through today. Now, as I've mentioned on previous episodes of the show, I have decided to stop releasing the actual play episodes of my campaign, mainly because there just doesn't seem to be a lot of interest in it, and it's a lot of work for me to produce and a lot of time that I think would be better spent working more on episodes like these that most of you are listening to and interested in, as opposed to the actual play, where a relatively small percentage of my listeners seem to download those episodes or listen to them. And I mentioned, it's probably been a couple months or so now ago, I mentioned this on our Discord and our MeWe communities to see what kind of response I got from people as far as thoughts about me not doing the actual play anymore. And I did hear from a few people that enjoy the actual play. But really no one said, please keep doing it. Even the people who enjoyed it, were kind of like, hey, if you don't have time or if you're not feeling it, don't do it. So I decided to stop producing those. However, I have, heard from a few of you that did enjoy the actual play. So I think I've come up with a good compromise, a way for those of you who were listening to the actual play and enjoying it to still kind of know what's going on without the massive time sink of producing actual play episodes that most of you aren't going to listen to anyway. And I think also might actually end up being content that the rest of you who don't listen to actual plays will find valuable. So what I'm going to start doing in some future episodes is I'm going to do some recaps of our campaign. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to get together with some of the players from my campaign, and as they're available, and we're just going to talk about the campaign, and we're going to pick up where the actual play left off, and we will basically summarize for you what happened, the main points, the main highlights of what happened each session, and just have some discussion about the campaign in general. So for those of you who were following along, you'll still be able to know what's happening and keep up with the story and what's going on with the characters and all that great stuff. But all in a lot less time than listening to a whole game session would take. And I think actually will be even more entertaining than the actual play, because let's face it, even with the best edited actual play, there's a lot of downtime. There's a lot of people rolling dice and doing math and extraneous conversations and just kind of wasted time in an actual play, which has always been something that's kind of bothered me about it as someone who produces actual plays and also as someone who's occasionally listened to or watched them is, if I sit down and produce or watch a 4-hour actual play, how much of that time is really interesting things happening and how much of it is kind of boring. And probably the best example of this actually is combat. Combat is a lot of fun when you're at the table playing, but to listen to an actual play of it, unless it is heavily edited and streamlined, can get pretty boring pretty fast because everything kind of grinds down to a crawl. And I want to give a shout out to the podcast Total Party Thrill. They're actually what kind of gave me this idea, because they've been doing this with various campaigns they've run. And I was just thinking the other day about how there are some of you that were really enjoying the actual play, and I felt kind of bad that I wasn't doing it anymore. And I started thinking about that podcast and how entertaining I found their campaign recaps, and how I actually personally enjoyed that far more than any actual play I've ever watched or listened to. So I thought, if I enjoy that kind of thing, maybe you will too. So we're going to try that. I'm getting together with some of the players later this week and next week, and we're going to start recapping the sessions. And I'm not sure what this is going to look like. We haven't done it yet, but right now I'm guessing that one episode will be a recap of one, maybe two sessions. I don't really know how long it will take. It will probably vary from game session to game session. For instance, especially when we only play for like 3 hours, we literally will have sessions that are just combat. And so recapping that actually probably would take like half an hour or less to really recap a combat, because even though in real world time, it might take us 2 or 3 hours to do that combat, to actually tell you what happened isn't going to take very long at all. So we'll see how that works. And definitely as those episodes keep or start coming out, please let me know what you think and whether or not you like those, especially if you're one of the ones who were digging the actual play. Let me know if this is better than nothing for you, hopefully. So speaking of that, thank you to everyone for the feedback I've been receiving. I kind of mentioned that the feedback had kind of dried up, and some of you have really stepped up and been getting a hold of me and giving some feedback, and I really appreciate it. And to everyone who sent any kind of feedback, thank you. And keep it coming. Really helps me decide what to do with this show. It gives me a better idea of what you all want to hear. Now, something else I want to talk to you guys real quickly at the beginning of the show about. Some of you probably already know about this if you follow me on social media or you're part of our Discord or MeWe community. But for those of you that don't know, I want to let you know that I have a post on my blog over at StarWalkerStudios.com that is a compilation of all of the sage advice segments from the Dragon Talk podcast. So the Dragon Talk podcast is a podcast produced by Wizards of the Coast. It's an official D&D podcast. And the Sage Advice segment is a segment where they have Jeremy Crawford on, who's the rules lead, and he talks about the rules. And each segment that they do, they'll have a topic that they talk about. For instance, they've done one about Druid Wild Shape. They've done ones about different types of weapons and all kinds of stuff. And they tend to zero in on rules that people either forget about or people get confused about or that they get a lot of questions about. So you might be familiar with the Sage Advice document, which is a compilation of rules, questions, and answers in a printed form. If you don't know about that, it's something to check out. It also has errata. So I'll have a link to that in the show notes at StarWalkerStudios.com if you want to check that out. It's a free PDF that you can download. So the Sage Advice segment on the Dragon Talk podcast is similar to that, but more of a discussion of the rules. And I have found it very educational and very interesting to listen to, because as a dungeon master, not only does it tell me how the rules work, but even more importantly to me, the thinking and the philosophy behind the rules, why the rules were made the way that they are, how they work, kind of the thinking behind it, which is really valuable as a DM anytime you're going to go beyond the rules, which, probably happens almost every game session. you're going to run into something that is not covered by the rules where you have to kind of just wing it. And the better that I, as a DM, understand the rules and understand the thinking and the philosophy behind the rules, the easier it is for me to come up with my own rules or my own interpretations or handle situations that come up that aren't covered by the rules in a way that is going to fit within that framework and not cause problems down the road, not do something that's too overpowered or too underpowered, because understanding the design philosophy behind the rules is really, really helpful for that. And just sometimes just makes things that are confusing far less confusing, or will bring to light things that I just completely didn't know about. For instance, they did one on spell targeting, where I found out that a lot of the spells in D&D 5th edition do not require any kind of line of sight to the target, where in previous editions, especially 3rd edition, I'm thinking of, most spells that did target something required a line of sight. So many of us who are used to earlier editions may assume that certain spells require a line of sight to the target when they don't, which really opens up possibilities for what the players can do with those spells once you realize, hey, they don't need to actually have a line of sight to the target. So that's just one example of something I personally learned from these segments that was very valuable to me. So these are great, and there's a lot of them. They've been doing these for years now. However, they don't do it on every episode of Dragon Talk. So unless you already listen to every episode of that podcast, you might miss some, or even a lot of them if you just kind of drop in from time to time to see if there's a sage advice. So what I've done on my blog is I've created a compilation of all of the sage advice segments. So it's just a list. It has all the segments. It has the topic of that segment. It has a direct link to that episode on Wizard's website if you want to go and see their show notes or listen to it on their website. It also has a direct link to download the MP3, so you can just download it right from my website if you want. And it also tells you the timestamp where the Sage Advice segment starts. So if you just want to hear the Sage Advice and you don't want to hear the rest of the podcast, you can skip right to that part. So I update that every month or two. As more episodes come out, I keep that up to date as best as I can. And like I said, there's been a lot of them. So if you haven't listened to any of them and you go start listening to them now, you've got hours of content to go through that will be very illuminating to you. If you're a DM who homebrews at all, this is something you really want to listen to, because it's very helpful in game, doing things on the fly, but it's especially helpful if you're going to design things for your game, like, designing your own monsters, which we're going to talk about today, or whatever. Understanding not only how the rules work, but the thinking behind the rules will be very helpful to you. And also if you're someone who wants to publish third-party stuff for D&D, this will be very valuable for you too. They're not really coming at it from the point of view of teaching you how to design for D&D to publish, but it's still going to really help you understand the rules and some of the inner workings of the rules, so that the stuff that you design for the stuff you're going to publish is going to fit the rest of the system better and hopefully avoid some problems you might have otherwise. So yeah, I highly recommend those segments. And again, head on over to starwalkerstudios.com/blog. I believe actually the URL for the actual article is starwalkerstudios.com/sageadvice. Or if you just actually go to starwalkerstudios.com, it's usually one of the more recent blog posts. You can find it pretty easily, but yeah, check that out. And if you want to get caught up on those or see if there's any that you've missed, again, I have all the topics there. So you can listen to all of them. You can just listen to the topics you're interested in, or you can just get the ones that you've missed. All right. So I just checked, and yeah, the URL is starwalkerstudios.com/blog/sageadvice if you're the kind of person that types URLs. Or just go to starwalkerstudios.com, go to the blog, and it'll be one of the top posts. So I pulled this up on my phone, and I'm not going to tell you all the topics they've covered, but just to name a few, They've talked about armor class calculations, how those work, spell targeting, temporary hit points, reactions, druid wild shape, stealth and invisibility, multi-classing, grappling, polymorph. They did an episode on that. Anti-magic, conditions, illusions, building encounters, bonus actions. They did an episode on customizing monsters that was interesting. I'll probably refer to that again later, and other stuff. So really cool. Now, something kind of interesting is at the time of recording this, the most recent Sage Advice they did was on the player's handbook rules. And it sounds like maybe they're going to do more of these, but they did a discussion of just a couple rules in the introduction of the player's handbook, which namely, going from memory, there's 2 rules in the introduction. The first rule is that specific always beats general. And the second rule being that if you do any kind of a calculation and you get a fraction, you round down. So they did a discussion on that, which I thought was really interesting, because I, as you know, have been doing an in-depth discussion of the player's handbook and the DMG for years now, a couple years, I think. Started back in episode 137, where I talked about the player's handbook prelude or introduction, whatever it's called, through chapter 4. And I talked about these 2 rules way back then. So, and it's funny because I've heard from numerous people over the years who have told me how valuable they find these discussion episodes about the rules of the game, and how, they feel like this is something Wizards should have done or should do, or they wished Wizards would do something like this. So it looks like maybe they're going to. Although, even if they are serious about going through all the rules, it's going to take forever because they don't do Sage Advice every week. And I mean, I don't do these discussion episodes every episode, and it's taken me, but I probably do them more often than they do Sage Advice. And it's taken me a couple years now just to get through the player's handbook and the DMG. So they're a bit behind. They got some catching up to do. So, I actually reached out to them on Twitter in the hopes that they might actually give a shout out to me, since I've already been doing this for years, for listeners of their show who might want to know about something further on in the books that they're not going to get to for a long time. But I didn't get any response to that, which is disappointing. But I thought I would just mention it to you all, in case you hear someone talking about this and saying, oh, hey, they're going to start talking about the rules on Sage Advice. You can say, well, if you don't want to wait years or however long it's going to take them to get to the DMG or whatever rule you're interested in, I know a podcast that's already done all this. And, I'm not an official Wizards podcast, but for the most part, I think I've been getting the rules right. So please refer them to this if you hear someone say something like that. And also just a reminder, if you go to the show notes for any of these episodes, I have the previous episodes in this series linked. So if you go to the show notes for episode 276, today's episode at StarWarsHeroes.com, I have links to all of the Player's Handbook episodes and all of the DMG episodes. So you can check them all out. So yeah, please spread the word, because it kind of amazes me how many people don't know that I've been doing this for quite a while now. Now, maybe changing the name of the show will help more people find it. But if you can help spread the word, word of mouth is still the most powerful form of getting things out there. So I'd be much obliged if you would do that. All right. So on that note, let's go ahead and move over to our discussion of the Dungeon Master's Guide, picking up right where we left off last time. We're going to be talking about creating a monster. This is in Chapter 9, Dungeon Master's Workshop. I'm starting on page 273. A couple things here at the top. First of all, as you probably noticed already, Brett is not with me today. Brett and I were planning to do this together, but we just haven't been able to do it. And the more I looked through this section, the more I felt that maybe I should just do this by myself, just because it's really long and there's a lot of information here. And even doing it by myself, I think it's going to take a couple episodes to get through all this. And, with two people, it's going to take even longer. So I'm going to try to power through at least some of it today by myself. And I still think it would be fun to do an example monster. So that could be something that Brett and I maybe do together on a future episode. And I was going to do that kind of as we go, kind of build a monster in example as we go through this, but that would make it take even longer. And I'm really worried about this taking so long that by the time we get to the end of the process, you've forgotten what the beginning was. So today I'm going to start just going through this. And then once we get through it, maybe Brett and I will create a monster together using these rules, or modify a monster together using these rules. So if that's something you'd like to hear, let me know, dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com. And also, if you have a suggestion for a monster that you'd like us to create, let me know that too. If we see something we really like, maybe that's what we'll do, because we're still, we haven't decided for sure what monster we're going to create together. So I think a cool thing to do would be something from another IP that isn't in D&D, like maybe a monster from The Witcher or something else that you think would make a cool D&D monster that isn't from D&D. We could take a stab at giving it D&D stats, or possibly some really cool monster from a previous edition of the game that hasn't been converted into 5th edition yet. But honestly, I think it'd be better to do something original, just because converting a monster from one edition to the other, it's really not that involved. So it'd probably be more helpful to you to see us create something from scratch. The other thing I want to say here at the beginning of this discussion is similar to the discussion of modifying monsters that Jeremy Crawford and Greg Tito did on Sage Advice on Dragon Talk. I am approaching this from the perspective of a DM who wants to create a monster for his or her home game. I'm not coming at this from the perspective of someone who is wanting to publish something. As Jeremy mentioned in that Sage Advice segment about this, there is more that goes into this when they design a monster than what we're given in the DMG. And this is pretty evident, I think. I've talked about way back in the past in earlier episodes about how when I was learning this and how to do this, and how I would take monsters from the monster manual and go through their process of determining the CR to see if I could get the CR they did, as kind of a way of checking my work to make sure that I really know what I'm doing and understand this. And quickly realized, especially with more complex monsters, that I almost never got the CR that they did. So it quickly became apparent to me that there was more going on underneath the hood of creating an official D&D monster than what we're given here in the DMG. And that was confirmed on that segment. They have some secret sauce stuff that they do. But for you as a dungeon master wanting to create your own monster for your own game, that's fine. That doesn't matter. You don't need something that can be published that's going to work at every table around the world. You just need something that's going to work at your table for this particular game session, for these particular players. And also, you have a luxury that those who publish monsters don't have, which is you can adjust things on the fly as you're running the monster during play. If you find out that maybe something isn't quite right, like, oh, the armor class is too low, or it's too high, or it has too many hit points or not enough, or it's doing too much damage, or anything like that, you can always adjust that while you're running the game. Where if you're publishing a monster, it kind of needs to be good as is. You can't predict how people will or won't adjust it. So that's the perspective we're coming through from here. We're not worried about trying to make a perfect monster that we can publish. It's going to stand up with things in the monster manual. We're only worried about making a monster that we can use in our game to entertain our players and ourselves, and something that isn't going to break our game. And so where that really becomes important is when you start thinking about CR. And when Brett and I were talking about this discussion about creating monsters, that was something that he brought up that he feels will be the most difficult part is how do you, once you've created this monster, how do you decide what its CR is? And that is the hardest part. But the nice thing is for a lot of you, it's not going to matter at all, because my impression from people I've talked to and people I've interacted with online is that most of you are not using experience for PC advancement. You're either using milestones or you're hand waving the leveling. Hand waving leveling is just saying when you feel like the player character should level, you tell them they level, and that's it. Milestones are where you determine that certain things that they accomplish in the game are either major or minor milestones, depending on the importance to the story that you're telling. And then you determine a set XP amount that they get for a major and a minor milestone. And that XP is usually some fraction of what they need to level. So that's the way most people these days are doing it. It seems very rare that I hear of a dungeon master who's actually just giving them XP for encounters and letting them, accumulate XP until they level. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We've talked about that on the show before. That could be a whole episode on the merits of different ways of leveling, but I'm pretty sure I've covered that before. So if you are one of those DMs that's either hand waving the leveling or doing milestones, then you don't really need to worry so much about CR, because you're not going to, the CR isn't going to be used to determine how much XP the player characters get anyway. All you're using the CR for as a DM is to get a very rough, very ballpark idea of how powerful is this monster and how, can my player characters take it or not? Which honestly, since you're designing your own monster anyway, you're going to have a better feel for that from how you design it, from things like its armor class, its hit points, how much damage it does. You're going to have a better feel of whether your player characters can handle it from all of that than you're going to get from a CR anyway. Because the CR is extremely ballpark. It's honestly, it's not terribly useful other than just as a very rough idea. If you're thinking that you can take a CR to the bank as far as whether your particular players will be able to handle it or not, that's often not the case. You can just look at monsters, like just look at a bunch of CR10 monsters, for instance, and you'll see a pretty wide range in deadliness among them. So it's really just a rough guide anyway. So don't stress out about the CR unless you do encounter-based XP. It doesn't really matter anyway. And even if you do encounter-based XP, all it's telling you is how much XP you're going to give the player characters, which, I mean, that's pretty arbitrary anyway. So it really doesn't matter. It's not worth stressing about. Worry more about, the flavor of the monster, how you're going to describe it, and the mechanics, whether they make sense. And as far as, how hard is this going to be for your player characters to deal with, look at things like armor class, saving throw bonuses, saving throw DCs for its abilities, how much damage it can do in a round, things like that. All right. So I think at this point, we have covered the preliminary stuff. So now I can start getting into this DMG in detail here. So the first thing I want to talk about here is modifying a monster. And as is mentioned here in the DMG, before you decide to create a monster, ask yourself if maybe you can get done what you need to do by modifying a monster instead. So instead of creating a brand new monster from whole cloth and just creating it from the ground up, can you take a monster that already exists in the game and just tweak it in a few ways to create the monster that you need? So they say here that, a stat block in the monster manual might make a good starting point for the monster that you want to make. Imagine, for example, that you want to create an intelligent arboreal predator that hunts elves. There's nothing quite like that in the monster manual, but you have the Quaggoth, which is a savage humanoid predator with a climbing speed. So you could take that stat block from the Quaggoth for your new monster and just change its name to something else and change the way you describe it a bit. And boom, there's your monster. Maybe you need a fiery phoenix, and you don't have a stat block for one, although now I think we do in one of the other books, but maybe you just have the monster manual and there's no fiery phoenix in there. So you could take a giant eagle or a rock, take that stat block, give it immunity to fire, and make its attacks deal fire damage instead of the damage they normally deal. And boom, there you go. You've got your phoenix. You need a flying monkey. Maybe take a baboon with wings and a flying speed. Just take the baboon stat block and add a fly speed to it. Things like that. So, a lot of the monsters you might want or need, you can create in this way, which is going to save you a lot of time. It's going to be a lot easier. And you don't have to worry so much about the kind of the balance stuff, or is it going to be too much of a challenge or too little of a challenge? Because you're starting out with an official monster that presumably is as balanced as anything like that can be already. And you're just making some minor changes to it, which isn't going to have a huge impact on its CR. So what you end up with should be, pretty similar to the monster you started out with, with a CR of plus or minus 1, maybe, or 2 at the most. It's going to be pretty close. So, just changing its damage type isn't going to change its CR. So I would say if you can get what you need by just modifying a monster that already exists, do it, because it'll save you time, it'll save you effort, and the end result may be better than what you would have come up with as far as fitting in with everything else and being the appropriate power level that you want and all that stuff. So they say here, adapting a stat block is far less time consuming than creating one from scratch. And there are changes you can make to an existing monster that have no effect on its CR. So some of these things that you can change on a monster that will not impact its CR are things like changing the languages it can speak, changing its alignment, or adding special senses like dark vision or tremor sense or blind sense or things like that. However, once you change the creature's offensive or defensive ability, such as its hit points or the damage it does, its challenge rating might need to change, as we'll talk about later. So another really easy way to modify a monster is to change the weapons that it uses. If a monster wields a manufactured weapon, like a sword or dagger, you can replace that weapon with a different one. For example, you could replace a hobgoblin's longsword with a halberd. Don't forget to change the damage and the attack's reach where appropriate. Also, be aware of the consequences of switching from a one-handed weapon to a two-handed weapon or vice versa. For example, a hobgoblin wielding a halberd, which is a two-handed weapon, loses the benefit of its shield, so its AC decreases by 2 because they can't use a halberd and a shield at the same time. And this is a really easy way to customize monsters. And honestly, I think we should all be doing this all the time anyway. And probably a lot of you are, because it's just kind of intuitive. You take like the hobgoblin, which, do I have my monster manual here? I do. Let's look up a hobgoblin just real quick here. Hobgoblin. Or you know what? Let's just take a goblin. I happen to turn to goblin. So we look at the goblin in the monster manual, and a goblin in a monster manual wears leather armor, uses a shield, and has a scimitar and a short bow. Now, if every goblin that your player characters encounter through the entire campaign wears leather armor, uses a shield, uses a scimitar, and uses a short bow, I mean, that's pretty freaking boring, right? And it breaks verisimilitude, because obviously that doesn't make any sense. Every goblin in the world would wear the same armor and use the same weapons, right? So I think it's only natural for DMs, just for variety and for realism, to say, oh, this goblin is going to use a short sword instead of a scimitar. This goblin doesn't wear any armor. This goblin doesn't use a shield. This goblin uses a long sword. This goblin has a longbow, things like that. So that's a really simple change you can make. Now, sometimes, depending on what you're changing, it may affect the CR. If it's going to increase or decrease the armor class, that will probably impact the CR. If it's going to increase or decrease the amount of damage it does, that will probably impact the CR. So if you take a goblin and you say, I'm going to have him use a long sword instead of a short sword, now it's doing a D8 instead of a D6 damage, then it might increase its CR. So that's something to think about. Again, doesn't really matter unless you're using encounter-based XP, and even then doesn't really matter. I mean, think about it. A goblin is a quarter CR, which I believe is 50 XP. If you raise it to a half CR because you increase its damage, now it's 100 XP. Like in the long scheme of things in your campaign, that extra 50 XP, whether you give it out or not, isn't going to matter. And again, if you hand wave leveling or you use some kind of milestone method, it really doesn't matter. So don't stress about it. My only concern would be, have I modified this monster so much that it's now way overpowered compared to what my player characters can handle? And, what I usually think about in that instance is I look at the player character in the party with the lowest amount of hit points, and then I look at how much damage the monster can do in a single round. And if you've pushed the damage up to the point where it can take out that character with the lowest hit points in a single round where it couldn't before, you might have gone too far, or just maybe make sure it doesn't attack that character. But that's going to be far more useful to you as a kind of litmus test of, is this monster too powerful, than the CR number anyway. So don't stress about that CR number. So yeah, changing their equipment. Obviously, this works best with monsters that use manufactured weapons, like they say, but there's no reason you can't do it with other monsters too. There's no reason you can't say this bear that you're creating, maybe its claws. I'm not going to look up a bear, but let's say a normal bear's claws do 1d6 and you decide your bear's claws do 1d8. You can do that. No reason why not. Again, it might affect the CR. But again, unless it's going to make a huge difference or it's going to maybe result in a TPK that wouldn't happen otherwise, it doesn't really matter. Another way to modify a monster that they point out here is adding a special trait. So you can add a special trait of your own devising or pick up a special trait from one of the many creatures in the monster manual. For example, you can create a goblin spider hybrid by giving the normal goblin the spider climb special trait, turn an ordinary troll into a two-headed troll by giving it the two-head special trait, or turn an owlbear into a flying owlbear by giving it wings and a giant owl's flying speed. Now, something I will point out here real quick that they should really mention here, and they don't, is that if you flip forward a few pages to page 280, there is a table on page 280 and 281 that has these special traits listed in alphabetical order. It gives the name of the trait. It gives, they call them monster features here, but that's what they're talking about, special traits. It gives an example monster that has that feature, so you can go look it up in the monster manual to see that feature on an actual monster. And then it gives you an idea of how that would impact the challenge rating of the monster you're creating. So for instance, I'll just grab a couple examples out of here because we'll probably come back to this later. Let's see. Let's find a relatively simple one. Okay, magic resistance. So a special trait you could give a monster is magic resistance, which means it gets advantage on saving throws versus spells and things like that. So an example monster that has that is a Baylor, but there's lots of monsters in the game that have magic resistance. That's just one example. And if you give a monster magic resistance that doesn't already have it, they're saying that it will increase the monster's effective AC by 2. Oh, crap. Okay, so this actually doesn't tell you directly how it impacts the CR. It impacts its effective AC, which now we're getting ahead of ourselves. So we'll talk about that a little later. But just suffice to say at this point that gives you an idea of what this is going to do to the CR of the monster that you're creating. So if you're creating a monster from scratch, or if you're modifying a monster and you're going to give it some of these special traits or maybe take some special traits away. And if for some reason you're concerned about the CR, which again, a lot of times you don't need to worry about it, you can look at this chart on page 280 and 281 to get some guidance on what impact that will have. All right, so next is creating quick monster stats. If all you need are simple stats for a monster of a particular challenge rating, follow the steps here. If you want to create something more akin to the monster stat blocks in the monster manual, skip ahead to the creating a monster stat block section. So basically, we'll go through this, but in a nutshell, you're looking at this table on page 274, monster statistics by challenge rating. And you just look up the challenge rating you want. So let's say I want a CR10 monster. I look at CR10 on the table and I see just a generic CR10 monster would have a +4 proficiency bonus, a 17 armor class, would have somewhere between 206 and 220 hit points, would have a +7 attack bonus, would do somewhere between 63 and 68 damage per round, and would have a spell save DC of 16 for its abilities. So you could just do that. You could be that quick and dirty with it. And this would be the way to do it on the fly during play. If for some reason something happens during play you didn't plan for, and all of a sudden you're like, crap, I need a CR5 monster that doesn't exist. Boom, you can look it up here on the table, CR5. It has a +3 proficiency bonus, 15 armor class, +6 attack bonus, 15 save DC, has somewhere between 131 and 145 hit points, and does somewhere between 33 and 38 points of damage. And boom, there you go. There's your monster. I mean, you can do that in less time than it just took me to say that on the fly during play. So honestly, that's something I have never done. And to be honest, I probably could have and forgot that I had this capability, that I had this handy chart. I use this chart all the time to create monsters that I'm going to just sit down and create. But I do tend to forget that I can use this chart on the fly during play, or even prepping for a game. If I just don't want to take the time to go through all the hoops of creating a full stat block, I just want something quick and dirty, I can use this table. So this is a good thing to bookmark in your DMG. You know, that'd be funny. I have these little Post-it note tabs, these colored Post-it note tabs, these sticky tabs for bookmarking things. Maybe you guys would like to know what I have bookmarked in my Dungeon Master's Guide. It's changed over the years. I used to have a lot more of them, but now, let's see, I have 4 of them. So this is just a quick aside, but what I have bookmarked in my DMG with these little tabs that I can flip to at any time, I have page 38 bookmarked, which is has a chart for starting equipment if you want to have a higher or lower fantasy or higher or lower magic campaign than what's assumed. So you can increase or decrease starting equipment based on that. So I've used that a lot for my campaigns. Usually mine's a bit higher magic than the standard campaign, and I want to give a little bit more at character creation. And another nice thing about this, it also gives you ideas of how to increase starting equipment if you're starting at something higher than first level. So for instance, you know, a standard campaign, if you're starting from 5th to 10th level, in addition to normal starting equipment, they get 500 gold plus 1d10 times 25 gold on top of that. So I find that handy. So I have that bookmark. My next bookmark is page 82, which is the encounter design or encounter balancing stuff. So page 82 has the XP thresholds by character level. And this is the DMG method for building encounters and figuring out how challenging they are. So I have that bookmarked. My next bookmark is page 134, which is gemstones and the beginning of all the treasure tables. So that's something that's nice to be able to flip right to. And then my next bookmark is page 274, which we're at right now, which is the monster creation stuff. So those are the 4 pages in the DMG I have bookmarked that I'm able to flip to immediately that I use all the time. All right. So basically to create a quick monster, we're going to be using this table, but we have steps here. So we'll go through this because a lot of times this could just be what you need and you don't need to go deeper than this. And also this is really going to set a good foundation for, going all out and creating a full monster later on, because we're going to be doing a lot of these things again. It's a lot of the same stuff. All right. So step 1 is expected challenge rating. So pick the expected challenge rating or the challenge rating that you want the monster to be. Knowing the monster's expected challenge rating will help you figure out the monster's proficiency bonus and other important combat stats. Don't worry about getting the CR exactly right. You can make adjustments later. A single monster with a challenge rating equal to the adventure's level is by itself a fair challenge for a group of 4 characters. Your mileage may vary on that. I find a single monster with a CR rating equal to the adventure's level is often a pushover. If it's all by itself. If it's with a bunch of other weaker monsters, that can be a good challenge. Or if you go and make it legendary, that can be a good challenge, but then that's going to increase its CR. So in my experience, that isn't really the case. They're usually pretty underpowered, but it's a conservative thing. So, if you're using that as a rule of thumb of a monster of a CR equal to the party's level is a good challenge, you're probably not going to have a TPK on your hands, which is probably what they're trying to avoid here. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that your monster must have a challenge rating equal to the level of the characters to be a worthy challenge. Keep in mind that monsters with a lower challenge rating can be a threat to higher level characters when encountered in groups. And that's very true. And oftentimes a large number of weaker monsters can be much more dangerous to your player characters than a few more powerful monsters. And that gets into action economy and just, if your characters are fighting 20 goblins, that's 20 actions that the bad guys get compared to, if you got 4 player characters, they have 4 actions. So over the course of multiple rounds, that disparity in the amount of actions that each side has is really going to come into play a lot. So it's something to keep in mind. So you can use weaker monsters, just use more of them. All right. So, that might be your step 1, saying, I want a monster of this CR. Or it may not be. So you don't have to start with that necessarily, but that's what they're suggesting. Decide your CR, and then you look at this chart on page 274, this monster stats by CR table. And based on that CR, that gives you a starting point. All right. So step 2 is basic statistics. So that's what I just said. You just look at this table based on the CR that you chose. And this gives you the monster's armor class, hit points, attack bonus, and damage output per round. Step 3, adjust statistics. So raise or lower the monster's armor class, hit points, attack bonus, damage output per round, and save DC as you see fit, based on whatever concept you have in mind for the monster. For example, if you need a well-armored monster, increase its armor class. Once you've made the desired adjustments, record the monster stats. If there are any other stats you think the monster needs, such as ability scores, follow the appropriate steps under creating a monster stat block. See, again, ability scores you may not need. It really depends on what you're going to do with this monster, how much you're going to use it. This is why every time I see a DM talk about making an NPC by creating a player character, using the player character rules and giving them a player character class and a level and all this to create an NPC, I just shake my head because, I mean, you can do it that way. There's no, I'm not going to tell you can't do that, but man, you're making a lot of work for yourself that you don't need. You look at even, a high CR monster like an Archmage, which is the equivalent of, what would it be, 17th or higher level wizard who has 9th level spells. And yeah, the Archmage stat block and all that, it's pretty involved, but nothing compared to if you made a 17th level wizard player character, what you'd have to deal with. So yeah, which would you rather deal with when trying to run a combat at the table? Especially considering you're probably going to have numerous NPCs at the same time. So that's why we use NPC stat blocks and not player characters for NPCs. All right. So step 4 is the final challenge rating. All right. Now this is something you really want to wrap your head around if you're going to create monsters and if you're going to worry about CR at all. Which, I mean, I don't want to come off sounding like I'm saying don't worry about CR at all. I'm just saying don't stress out about it. You do want to look at the CR just to make sure, again, you're not making something that's way weaker or way more powerful than what you're going for, just to make sure you're in the right ballpark. But don't agonize over it is what I'm saying. All right, so this is an important thing, and this is probably the most complicated part of this whole process. So it's important to understand it. So basically, to get the final challenge rating, you're going to come up with 2 numbers. And these numbers don't mean anything when playing the game. These are just for designing a monster. And once you design the monster, these numbers no longer matter. So you're going to come up with a defensive challenge rating and an offensive challenge rating. So we're going to come up with those 2 numbers, and then we're going to average them. Okay. Which will be our final number that's going to tell us the CR of our monster. So we'll start with defensive challenge rating. So to find the defensive challenge rating for your monster, and this is going to be the same thing we do with a monster we create for a full stat block. You look down the hit points column of the monster stats by CR rating table on page 274. You look down the hit points and you find your monster's hit points. Okay. And then you look across and see what CR that is. Okay. So I'm just going to pick a number out of the air, 180. Okay. So I've created a monster that has 180 hit points. I look on this table and I see here, okay, hit points 176 to 190. Okay. So 180 is in that range, right? So I look across, that's CR8. So right now, if my monster has 180 hit points, I have a defensive challenge rating of CR8. So if you're following along, I hope you see how I got that number. I looked at the hit points column. I found where 180 hit points would be, and I look, and that's CR8. CR8 is 176 to 190 hit points. Okay, so I write that number down, CR8, or just 8, okay? Next, we're not done. Next, I look at the armor class suggested for a monster of that challenge rating. So I look at CR8 and it says a CR8 monster has an armor class of 16 on that table. If your monster's AC is at least 2 points higher or lower than that number, adjust the challenge rating suggested by its hit points up or down by 1 for every 2 points of difference. Okay, so let me give you an example. So I'm creating a monster. My monster has 180 hit points. You know what? I should write this down. All right, so my monster has hit points 180. I'm going to say I want this to be a beefy monster, and I'm not looking at the table. Or maybe I should, because we want to pick something that would adjust. Yeah, let's say he has an armor class of 18. I'm just making up numbers here, okay? So I look at 180 hit points. So again, we're trying to figure out this defensive challenge rating. I abbreviate this as DCR in my notes when I'm doing this. So I say DCR, DCR. Okay. So first I look at hit points. 180 hit points. I look at my table. I see that's CR8. So I have DCR is 8 so far. Then it says I look at the armor class for that CR. So again, CR8, they're calling for a 16 armor class. Then I look at my armor class that I've given my monster. I gave my monster an 18 armor class, which is more than 16. So this says if the armor class is 2 or more or less than the armor class that this table says, then I'm going to adjust my DCR, or my defensive challenge rating. So 18, which is the armor class I've given my monster, is 2 higher than the 16 that a CR8 monster should have. So that's going to increase my DCR by 1. So I put 8 plus 1, or I put 9, right? Does that make sense? So let me go through that again, because it's sometimes hard to wrap your brain around this stuff just verbally. Okay, so we started with I already have a monster I've created. I'm trying to figure out what's my CR. I started with the hit points, which are 180, which tells me it's CR8 on this table. And then I look at what the armor class should be for a CR8, which is 16. And then if my armor class is different by 2 or more, either way, then for every 2 points, I adjust the defensive challenge rating by 1 up or down accordingly. So for every 2 points above 16 armor class, I would add 1 to the DCR. Or if my monster had less than 16 armor class, for every 2 points below 16, I would decrease the DCR by 1. If it's only a difference of 1 armor class, you don't do anything. It doesn't matter. So in my example, my monster has an armor class of 18, which is 2 higher than the 16 of a CR8 monster. So because my armor class is 2 higher than what a CR8 monster is calling for, I increase that defensive challenge rating by 1, changing it from 8 to 9. So right now, my monster has a defensive challenge rating of CR9. All right, and that's it for defensive. We're done with defensive challenge rating. So right now, I have a defensive challenge rating of 9. So now we determine our offensive challenge rating, or OCR is how I abbreviate it. So now this is a very similar process as what we did before. Remember before, for the defensive, we started with our hit points, read down the table, found our hit points to see what our beginning defensive challenge rating is. So for offensive, we're going to do the same kind of thing, but we're going to look at our damage per round. So read down the damage per round column of the monster statistics by challenge rating table until you find your monster's damage output per round. Then look across and note the challenge rating suggested for the monster who deals that damage. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky, because people ask, how do I know what my damage per round is? So actually, to talk about this, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. I'm going to skip ahead to page 278, the left-hand column, about halfway down the page. You see in bold, overall damage output. You kind of need to know this to use this other method. I don't know why it's 2 pages later. So if you're like me and the first time you read this and you got really confused, it was because you're probably wondering, well, how do I know what the damage output is? And they don't tell you that until later, when you're fully designing a monster. But we're going to go into it now, and we'll go into it again later, because this is the thing I think that most trips people up, at least people I've talked to about this. Okay, so to determine a monster's overall damage output, take the average damage it deals with each of its attacks in a round and add them together. So the average damage is just the number it says after the attack. So, let me get a stat block. We got our goblin here, right? So if I look at my goblin, I look at the scimitar attack. It says melee weapon attack, +4 to hit, reach 5 feet, 1 target, hit 5 slashing damage, 5 parentheses 1d6 plus 2 slashing damage. So that 5, that's your average damage. So you just take your monster that you've created, you take those average damage numbers and add them together. Now you're asking, how do I get average damage? See, it's like this rabbit hole you go down. It keeps getting more complex the deeper you go. So the average damage is just the average of the die plus the bonus. So let's look at the scimitar for the goblin here. A goblin using a scimitar does 1d6 plus 2 slashing damage. Okay. So what is the average of 1d6? Now you can figure this out using math. But there's an easy kind of rule of thumb for knowing these numbers. That's kind of a shortcut, so you don't have to do the math every time. The average roll for any die is half the die plus 0.5. So a d6, the average roll, what's a half of 6 is 3, right? Plus 0.5. So the average for a d6 is 3.5. Okay. Let's just do all the dice. So d4, average roll for a d4 is 2.5. Half of 4 is 2 plus 0.5, 2.5. Half of a d6 is 3.5. Half of 6 plus 0.5. Half of a d8 is 4.5. Half of 8 plus 0.5, 4.5. Half of a d9. There is no d9. Half of a d10 is 5.5. Half of a d12 is 6.5. Half of a d20 is 10.5. Half of a d30, which we don't use in D&D, but they're out there, is a 15.5 because half of 30 is 15 plus 0.5. Half of a d100 percentile is 50.5. Okay? Easy peasy. So to find the average damage, because let's say you're creating your own monster, you're not going to have a stat block to tell you what the average damage is, right? So, the goblin is 1d6.2 slashing, or 1d6.2, sorry, man, 1d6 plus 2 slashing damage. If we're going to roll the damage, we'd roll 1d6 and add 2. So we want to know what's the average for that. Well, the average of 1d6 is 3.5, right? And then we just add that plus 2. So 3.5 plus 2 is 5.5. And remember, I just mentioned this a little while ago. One of the base rules of the game is anytime you have a fraction, you round down. So 3.5 plus 2 is 5.5. And then we round that down to 5. So our average damage is 5. So let's take another example. Let's say the monster you're creating does 1d8 plus 4 damage. Okay. What's the average damage? Well, the average of 1d8 is 4.5. Half of the d8 is 4 plus the 0.5, 4.5. And then what did I say? 1d8 plus 4. So 4.5 plus 4 is 8.5. So the average would be 8. And another thing, just as a quick aside, rounding down the fractions, you don't do that until the very end. Okay, so you'll see this when you look at the average hit points of monsters with a lot of hit die. They don't drop off that 0.5 until the end of the equation, not every step of the way. Boy, am I getting in the weeds here? I probably am. But I want you guys to understand this, and it's, once it's explained to you, it's not that hard to understand. But think, okay, let's look at let me find something that has a lot of hit points that won't be too confusing, hopefully. Okay, let's look at a salamander here. So a salamander has 12 d10 plus 24 hit points, and the average hit points is 90. So I'm just looking at the salamander stat block here. So if we were going to figure this, let me grab my calculator. So the first thing is, what's the average of a D10, right? Is 5.5. Now, the way Wizards does it, 12 D10 plus 24 is the hit dice. They take 12 times 5.5, add 24, and then drop the fraction. Okay, so 12 times 5.5 is 66 hit points plus 24 is 90 hit points, which is what they have here. They don't drop the fraction from the 5.5. Like, I hope that makes sense. Hopefully you have enough math that makes sense to you, that you don't round until the end of the equation. You don't round every step of the way. Because if they rounded every step of the way and they said, okay, the average of a D10 is 5.5, but we're going to round that down to 5, then they'd be taking 12 times 5 plus 24 is 84 hit points, which is not what this says. It says 90 hit points. So I hope that makes sense. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're doing these calculations. You don't round off that fraction until the very end. All right. Oh my gosh, man, we're like nested rabbit holes within rabbit holes within rabbit holes. So if you remember, we were trying to figure out our damage output because we're trying to figure out our offensive challenge rating. And in order to do that, we need to know the damage output per round. And we asked ourselves, well, how do we get that number? And the way you get that number is you take the average damage of all the attacks that the creature can do in a single round and you add those together. And then we wondered, well, how do we know the average damage if it's something we created? It's not something in the book. And that's what I just explained to you, is how to figure out what the average damage is. So now getting back to damage output, because there's a little bit more to it than that, as you've probably guessed, because not all creatures are that simple. Like what happens if they use magic or something? All right, so it says take the average damage it deals with each of its attacks in a round and add them together. So if we look at the goblin here, I mean, this is a really simple monster. The goblin can either attack with a scimitar or a short bow on a round. It can do both. And they both do average of 5 damage. So whichever one it uses, it does the same damage. So it does 5 damage per round is its damage output. It's a really simple example because it only has one attack. And both of the options for that attack do the same damage. But not every monster is going to be that simple. If a monster has different attack options, use the monster's most effective attacks to determine its damage output, which is to say, use the attacks that use the most damage. So let's say we have a monster that has different attacks that do different damage. For instance, right next to the monster or right next to the goblin is the goblin boss. If we look at the goblin boss's actions, well, first of all, it has multi-attack. So it gets 2 attacks with its scimitar. The second attack has disadvantage. Okay, well, let's ignore that because that's getting complicated. But if we look at just its 2 weapons, it has a scimitar and a javelin. The scimitar does 5 damage. The javelin only does 3 damage. So when we try to figure out what this creature's damage output is, we're going to use the scimitar damage because that's the most damage of its options. Like it could use a javelin or it could use a scimitar. The scimitar is the one that does most damage. So that's the number we use. I really hope that makes sense. Please, if you have questions about any of this, email me, dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com. I'm happy to come back to this and revisit this. If anything is confusing the way I'm trying to explain it to you, I'm happy to, help you guys understand this. All right. So if it has multiple attacks to choose from, different attacks, we pick the one that does the most damage. All right. For example, a fire giant can make 2 greatsword attacks or 1 rock attack in a round. The greatsword attacks deal more damage, so that attack routine determines the fire giant's damage output. So that's also illustrating, like a fire giant, if you have a monster that can either take multiple attacks with one weapon or a single attack with another weapon, you figure out which does more damage, the multiple attacks with the one weapon or the single attack with the other weapon, and that's the number that you use. And if it gets multiple attacks, you'd add it together. So for instance, if I had a goblin that gets 2 attacks a round with that scimitar, my damage output per round would be 10 because I do 5 damage with each scimitar attack and I get 2. So and this is the thing that always kind of, and still confuses me, is we're just assuming all the attacks hit, which they're not going to. But I mean, whatever we do, we have to make assumptions. So I'll bet this is a point that's part of the secret sauce. I'll bet when they're designing a monster and they're figuring damage output, they are not assuming that every single attack hits, because that's not really an assumption that's going to hold up in play most of the time. I'll bet they're assuming half the attacks hit or 3/4 or something. I don't know what the special sauce is, so I don't know what that number is, but I'll bet it's not an assumption that every single attack hits. So if we're looking for points of why we're diverging, our CR calculations versus what they're getting with the special sauce, I'm guessing this is one of those points of divergence because they've simplified this for us and said, just assume everything hits. Don't worry about what are the odds. that this attack is going to hit or not. Just assume they all hit. Okay. All right. I'm going between all these books. This is crazy. All right. This is why I kept putting off this episode, because I knew this is going to be kind of a nightmare to try to do this in a podcast. But we're going to do this. All right. So we took the average damage from the attacks, each of its attacks at each that it can do in a round. I mean, like the goblin has 2 separate attacks, but it can only use one of them. So, we don't add both those attacks together because it can only use one per round. If it has multiple attacks, we add those together. If it has multi-attack, if it has different attacks it can choose from, we pick the one that has the most damage. And now we have our damage output. Okay. If a monster's damage output varies from round to round, calculate its damage output for each round for the first 3 rounds of combat, and then take the average. So again, it gets more and more complicated depending on how complex your monster is. So for example, a young white dragon has a multi-attack routine, 1 bite attack and 2 claws attacks that deal an average of 37 damage per round. So if you look at the young white dragon stat block, and you look at the bite attack damage and 2 claw attack damages, and you add those together, you get 37 damage. Okay. So that's one thing it could do in a round, is it could do its multi-attack, do 37 damage, assuming everything hits. It also has a breath weapon that deals 45 damage, or 90 if it hits 2 targets, and it probably will. So in the first 3 rounds of combat, the dragon will probably get to use its breath weapon once and its multi-attack routine twice. So you would average that. So the multi-attack does 37. So you've got 37 for 2 rounds, 37 damage for 2 rounds. And then we're saying that the breath weapon does 90 damage because it does 45 damage. And we're going to assume that it's going to hit 2 characters. Again, how they assume 2 characters, I don't know, like how they pulled that number out of the air. And again, that's probably another thing that's part of the secret sauce is how many with like area of effect attacks, how they determine how many characters that hits for the damage. But for this example, we're assuming it hits 2 characters. So that's 90 damage, double the breath weapon damage. So over 3 rounds, it would do 90 damage the first round, and then 37 damage the second 2 rounds. So we add 90 plus 37 plus 37 for the total for 3 rounds of combat. And then we divide by 3 to get the average number of damage it did over those 3 rounds, which you do that 90 plus 37 plus 37 divided by 3 is 54. And again, at the very end of that equation, we round 54 down. So actually, what is that? Let me see what the actual number is. 37 plus 37 plus 90 is 164 damage over 3 rounds. Then we divide that by the 3 rounds, and we get 54.6 repeating 6 damage per round. We drop the 0.66666 and we get 54. So that's how you do that. When calculating a monster's damage output, also account for special off-turn damage dealing features such as auras, reactions, legendary actions, or lair actions. For example, a Balor's fire aura deals 10 fire damage to any creature that hits the Balor with a melee attack. The aura also deals 10 fire damage to all creatures within 5 feet of the Balor at the start of each of the Balor's turns. If you assume that one character in the party is within 5 feet of the Balor at all times, hitting it with a melee weapon every round, then the Balor's damage output per round increases by 20. So this is it. Probably the 2 things that will trip people up with this is figuring out the overall damage output and figuring out the the offensive and defensive CR. So that's really what you want to wrap your head around. Once you get these things, the rest is pretty easy. So if I were you, I would recommend just reading this overall damage output section here on page 278. Read through it a few times, work through examples on your own, and play with the numbers, and just do it until it makes sense to you. It'll make sense to you eventually, I think. That's the great thing about math. It's pretty rational and logical. And it's all pattern based. So it's just getting your mind to see and understand the pattern. And then once you got that pattern, then you can use that pattern to do things, like design monsters. All right. So we're going to go back to page 274, step 4, final challenge rating. And we're in offensive challenge rating. So we we're reading down our damage per round. So what is our damage per round, which we just figured out for our monster? We read down the table to find out what CR that is for our OCR. So for my example, I've got a monster with 188 hit points. It has an armor class of 18. We came up with a defensive challenge rating of 9. And so now what kind of damage does it do? You know what? I'm going to say it uses a longsword. It does 1d8 plus, we'll do the 1d8 plus 4 damage. And let's say it has multi-attack and it can attack twice around. Okay. So what is my damage output for this monster? So 1d8 plus 4, average damage of that is, again, I take the d8, I take half of that plus 0.5. So that's a d8, half of 8 is 4. So that's 4.5 is the average damage for a d8. And it's 1d8 plus 4. So I take 4.5 plus 4 equals 8.5 damage per attack. Now, this is a perfect example of how the rounding works, okay? So each of my attacks do 8.5 damage, average damage. And I would round that down to 8, right? But if I want to be more precise, it gets 2 attacks. So I could either say its damage output is 16, or I could say it's 17, right? Let's see if it actually matters on the table. That'd be funny if it did. No, it doesn't matter. So it's kind of academic, but I think, and someone correct me if they know better, but I think the more correct thing here would be to say that my damage output is 17, because I take the 8.5 plus 8.5 and I don't round that down until I'm done. So 8.5 plus 8.5 is 17, as opposed to saying 8.5 rounded down to 8 plus 8.5 rounded down to 8 is 16. Although now that I'm saying that, I think it might be different with damage, because I can't really because they're 2 separate attacks, I can't do 8.5 damage. I don't know. But luckily, it doesn't matter, because when you look at the hit or the damage per round column of this table, we've got CR2 is 15 to 20 damage. So, 16 and 17 are both within that range. So in this case, it doesn't matter. So honestly, as far as the damage per round, I wouldn't worry about rounding the fractions at the end, because especially if you're using a stat block in the monster manual to go by, all of those attacks are already rounded for you. You're not going to see an attack that does 8.5 average damage. They're already rounded. So I would just use those numbers and not worry about it. So anyway, so we say I have 2 attacks that do 8 damage. So my damage output per round is 16, which I call that, I have abbreviations for all this because I've done this so much. I call that DPR, damage per round, is 16. So offensive challenge rating, I take my damage per round, which is 16. I look at the damage per round part of the table, and you'll notice this table also, there's a defensive and offensive section to it, if you notice at the top, which is helpful. Damage per round, 16 is CR2, which is 15 to 20. So right now I have an OCR of 2, an offensive challenge rating of 2 based off my damage per round. All right, now that I have that number, that CR2 number, I look at the attack bonus suggested for a monster of that challenge rating. And this is going to be the same thing as we did with the armor class with the DCR, with the defensive challenge rating. We look at the attack bonus, and if my monster's attack bonus is at least 2 points higher or lower than that number, then I'm going to adjust the challenge rating by 1 for every 2 points of difference. All right. So let's say I'm not even going to look at the table. I should, because I want it to be different. So right now we're at a challenge rating of 2 for the offense. So let's say I have a +5 bonus to hit on this monster. Okay. So my monster has a or did I say 5? I mean 4. I wrote one number and said another. So my monster has a +4 to hit, does 1d8 + 4 damage, which is an average of 8 damage, and has 2 attacks a round. So an average of 16 damage per round with an attack bonus of +4. So we've already determined based on the damage per round that it has an offensive challenge rating of 2. And I look at CR2 on the table, and it tells me I need an attack bonus of +3. So +4 is not +3, but it's only one difference. So I don't change the challenge rating. So my OCR is still 2. Now, if my attack bonus were +5, then that would be 2 higher than the +3. So I would add 1. You know what? Let's do that because I want it to be different. So let's say my attack bonus is +5. All right. So challenge rating 2 calls for an attack bonus of +3. Mine's +5, which is 2 higher. So I add 1 to my offensive challenge rating. All right. Now, this is assuming a monster who does its damage by using physical attacks. If the monster relies more on effects with saving throws than on attacks, use the monster's save DC instead of its attack bonus. So let's say my monster is doing damage with spells that don't require attack rolls, but instead require you to make a saving throw. I would still figure out my damage per round based on the spell. What's the average damage of the spell? I would find my damage per round to find my challenge rating, my offensive challenge rating. But then instead of looking at the monster's attack bonus, I would look at its save DC. And I would look at the save DC on this table. And it's the same kind of thing. If the save DC of my monster is higher or lower than the save DC on this table by 2 or more, then I will increase or decrease the offensive CR by 1 for every 2 points of difference. So for instance, our CR2 here calls for a save DC of 13. So if my save DC is 15, I would add 1 to the OCR because that's 2 higher than 13. If it was 17, I would add 2 because that's 4 higher than 13. If it were 11, I would subtract 1 because that's 2 lower than 13. All right. And then we just add this together. So for my example monster here, I have an offensive challenge rating of 3. All right. So let me go through those real quick because I know there's been a lot of asides and digging down into things a little more. So let's just overview this really quick again. So we started with defensive challenge rating. We looked at our hit points, found that on the table, saw what CR that corresponded to. Then we looked at that CR on the table and saw what our armor class should be. Then we looked at our monster's armor class and adjusted the defensive challenge rating by 1 for every 2 points our armor class was above or below the suggested armor class. So for my defensive challenge rating, my monster had 180 hit points. So I look on the table, I find 180 hit points. I see that that is equivalent to a CR8 monster. And then I look at that CR8 line on the table and I see it's suggesting an armor class of 16. My monster, however, has an armor class of 18, which is 2 higher than 16. So I add 1 to my defensive CR. So my defensive CR is 8 based on the hit points, plus 1 for the 2 points of extra armor class for a defensive CR of 9. For the offensive CR, we do something very similar, except we start with the damage output per round, which we went into how you figure that out. We look down the damage per round column. So my monster has a damage per round of 16. I look down, I see that 16 damage per round is a CR2. Now I'm going to either look at the attack bonus or the save DC based on how am I doing that damage. Am I doing it with attack rolls, whether that's a spell or a weapon, doesn't matter, or is it an attack that the player character makes a save against? So my monster is using a sword, it's using attack rolls. So I'm going to look at my attack bonus. So my offensive CR right now is 2 based on the damage output. And I see that calls for an attack bonus of +3. However, I've decided that my monster has an attack bonus of +5. So that's 2 points higher than the bonus of +3 called for on the table. So I'm going to add 1 to my offensive CR, bringing it from 2 to 3. So I now have a defensive CR of 9 and an offensive CR of 3. So I now average them. So I take 9 plus 3, which is 12, divided by 2 is 6. So the CR of my monster is 6. Oh, one other thing that they mentioned here that I don't think I said is when you're doing the offensive challenge rating, if your monster uses different attack bonuses or save DCs, like maybe has a bunch of different stuff, use the ones that you think will come up the most often. So that makes sense. All right, so then we average the challenge rating, which we just did. So now that you have your final challenge rating for your monster, which for my example is CR6, you can determine the monster's proficiency bonus using this table we've been using all this time. So I look up CR6 on this table and I see a CR6 monster should have a +3 proficiency bonus. So for anything that I need to know about this monster that uses proficiency bonus, I know it's got a +3. And then they have an experience by challenge rating table here. If you're using XP, you can figure out how much XP it is. So I see here a CR6 monster is worth 2,300 XP. So they say here, creating a monster isn't just a number crunching exercise. The guidelines in this chapter can help you create monsters, but the only way to know whether a monster is fun is to playtest it. After seeing your monster in action, you might want to adjust the challenge rating up or down based on your experiences. Or you may want to adjust other things. You may want to adjust the damage or the armor class or the hit points, depending on how you think your monster worked. All right, you know what? Wow, this has already been really long, and we just did the creating quick monster stats. Next up is creating a monster stat block, which we're going to go through the same process but with more detail. And in this, we're going to start bringing in things like these special abilities that we talked about a little bit before, how that impacts armor class, things like, damage vulnerabilities, resistances, and immunities. We're really going to get into the weeds with this stuff. So this is more than enough for a single episode, I think. So I'm going to put a pin in this here. And I think this is actually good because, next time we're going to go through this process again, but we're going to go even more in depth and more detail than what this was. So it's really important before we go forward that we all understand what we just talked about and we're all on the same page there. So, if you listen to this and you don't quite get it, listen to it again, sit down with it, sit down and create a simple example monster for yourself like I did here and go through these steps, maybe do it a few times until it makes sense to you. If you've done all that and you still don't understand, shoot me an email, dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com, and let me know what you're confused about or whatnot, and I'll try to help you. Now, I have a feeling that those of you that email me, a lot of the stuff you're going to ask me is probably going to be stuff that we're going to cover next. That's more kind of more situational stuff or corner cases, stuff like that. And that's fine. Like I still want to hear your questions because it'll help me decide how to approach this next part. And that's fine. That's great. But hopefully if there's something that I didn't explain well or isn't clear, hopefully I'll get feedback from you guys and that'll become clear to me and I can explain it, because we're going to kind of go through this thing again next time. So maybe if there's something that was catching people up, I can address that. But yeah, please, if you just listen to this once and you're like, I don't get it, don't email me a question. I mean, do your due diligence. Listen to my explanation a couple times. Sit down with the DMG, read it for yourself. Get a scrap piece of paper, create a simple monster like I just did, and go through it a couple times. Do your homework. And if you still don't understand it, I'm happy to help you. But I don't want to get a bunch of questions from people who just don't understand it because they just listened to it once. And it's going to take more than that. If you want to join, or if you want to design your own monsters, there's going to be a little math involved. There's going to be some thinking involved, some number crunching. If, you care about it. If you're just going to make whatever you want to make and throw it at your characters and hope they survive it, that's great. Do that. But if you're concerned about kind of having something that's in the ballpark of a CR you're shooting for or something like that, then you're going to have to go through this process. And I think Wizards has already simplified it as much as they can. And already, we see discrepancies between the numbers we get and the numbers they get because it's been simplified. So if they simplified it anymore, it probably wouldn't be at all useful. So it's kind of par for the course, as they say. So if you're not willing to do that, if you're not willing to sit down and figure this out, then don't design monsters. Or if you design them, don't worry about this stuff and just have it do what you think it should do. Or just reskin stuff or modify stuff like we talked about in the very beginning. There's so many stat blocks out there now. You've got the Monster Manual, you've got Volo's Guide to Monsters, you've got Mordenkainen's Tome of Foes. So we've got 3 sort of monster books with tons of monsters. Plus most of or all of the adventures they put out have new monsters. So there's plenty of stat blocks out there already. So chances are really good, whatever you're wanting to do, there's something out there that's close enough that you can just make a few tweaks to it and boom, you're there. And then you don't have to do all this math and stuff and averaging and stuff like that. So I tend to think that there are 2 kinds of people. There are people that dig this kind of stuff and like this kind of crunchy stuff and will enjoy this kind of design. And then there are people that don't. And that's awesome. I mean, that's fine. That's awesome. It's not like one person's better than the other, but if you're the kind of person that digs this kind of thing, then, sit down with it and figure it out. It's not that hard to figure out. And it's really just grasping it. And I think if you practice it a few times, you'll get it. And if not, ask me questions. I'm happy to help. But if you're one of the people that you're just listening to this and you're like, oh my God, I don't want to do math, then you don't have to. Just find a stat block that's close and change what you need to change to make it fit what you're wanting to do. And don't even worry about the CR. If you're still using XP for encounters and stuff, just stop. I am someone who until pretty recently, like a few months ago, always used XP. This encounter or this campaign I'm running right now, I used XP until very recently. And I'd worry about giving the players enough encounters so they have enough XP to level when I want them to level, and do all this math at the end of every session to figure out how much XP everybody gets, and worry about what happens to people if they miss. Do they get XP? If so, how much? And finally, the light came to me. And I finally realized what people have been trying to tell me for years, which is that's a lot of extra work that's really unnecessary and honestly wasted. Because I talked to my players about it and not one of my players cared about the XP. Players care about their characters leveling occasionally. That's all they care about. I've yet, in my experience, to meet a player who really cares about the XP, who really wants to know, I got 313 XP this session because I did this, and this. And that was kind of my thinking, because there's probably some of you that are like me. I was thinking of XP as a reward, right? So, if you kill 10 goblins, you get more XP than if you kill 8. Or if you parlay with the goblins and make a deal with them, you get the same XP you would have gotten if you fought them and killed them, but it takes a lot less time and you don't risk your character dying. So both of those are rewarding what you're doing in the game with XP, with this number of things that you get, XP points. And I thought that was a great, like, kind of carrot to reward players and their characters for what they're doing. And that's why I thought it was worth me doing all the math to figure out how much XP they get and worrying about giving them enough encounters to get the XP they need. And all these extra headaches that dealing with XP adds to your life as a DM. I thought it was worth it because I'm giving the players this reward. You know, you do this thing, you get rewarded. But it turns out when I talked to the players about it, they didn't care. And it wasn't, to them, it wasn't perceived that way, or it just they didn't care. I don't know of another way to say it. You know, most of them weren't even paying attention to the XP other than when they leveled. That's all they care about. And I even remember players saying, did we level? And that's all, you know, all they wanted was a yes or no to that question. Beyond that, they didn't care how much XP they had. So yeah, you know, if you're still using XP, at the very least, I recommend have a chat with your players and find out what their experience is and if they even care about the XP, or if they would mind if you went to hand waving the leveling. If you're like, hey guys, what if I just leveled you every 3 sessions? Or what if I just leveled you when it seemed dramatically appropriate? You might find out that your players are like, yeah, that'd be great. Or we really don't care. Do what you want. And in that case, you may find, like I did, that you're doing all this extra work for nothing. It's not helping you. It's not helping the players. It's just wasted time and energy. So I've done a 180 very recently. Until very recently, I was all about encounter-based XP and leveling based on XP. And only very recently have I changed my mind. So if you're new to the show, don't think that I've always been this way and I'm all about, you know, don't use XP. I just came to this realization myself. And, you know, of course, now I think everybody should do it this way. But yeah, you know, especially when it comes to designing these monsters, if you're just designing a monster for your game, for your players, and you're hand waving, leveling, or even just using milestones, then you really don't need to agonize about the CR and the XP stuff. You can just get it in the ballpark that you want and call it done. Now, if you're going to publish this for other people to buy, then yeah, you need to really understand this. And beyond that, you probably need to figure out the special sauce that Wizards has as much as you can on your own, so that your monsters are as in line with their stuff as possible without knowing secret things, which is what I did. Yeah. So that's part of doing that, but that's not most of us. It's not most of you. Probably most of us are just running games for our players, and we don't need to worry about that stuff, which is awesome. So yeah, if you have any questions or something about this confused you, shoot me an email, dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com. If you have a suggestion for a monster Brett and I could create together to kind of illustrate this whole process, let me know that as well. All right, well, that is going to wrap it up for episode 276 of Dungeon Master's Journey. If you'd like to get a hold of me, you can shoot me an email, dungeonmastersjourney@gmail.com. You can also follow me on Twitter @LexStarwalker. And I have a voicemail you can 951. What did I just say? I don't know what I just said. I have a voicemail you can call. That number is 951 GMJ Lex 1. That's 951-465-5391. My brain is like pudding now after doing all that stuff. Please join our community on MeWe and Discord. You can find links to those in the show notes at starwalkerstudios.com/Dungeon Master's Journey. And yeah, if you enjoy what I'm doing here and you'd like to support what I'm doing, a great way to do so is to check out my self-published D&D supplements. I have an adventure called The Trickster's Labyrinth, which you can really use whatever D&D setting you use. It will work. I have Relics of Power, which is my relics, which are magic items that grow in power. as your character grows in power. So Relics of Power shows you how you can create those for yourself, how you can take existing magic items in the game and convert them into relics, and also gives you some examples, including the relics from my current campaign, Blood of the Avatars. So if you're curious about those relics, they're in that supplement. And then my third one is Adventures of Primordia, which is player character options that I've developed for my game. New cleric domains, equipment, spells, magic items, that kind of stuff, and some sub races, stuff like that. So yeah, it's a great way to support the show, support what I'm doing. You can find all those on the store at starwalkersheroes.com. And another great way to support the show is to become a patron. And finally, if you're a little short on cash right now, which I know a lot of us are, another great way that you can support the show is just to tell your friends about it. Especially these episodes that I'm doing. If you have other DM friends or maybe friends that are thinking about starting the DM and you think they'd benefit from these discussions of the rules that I've done for the Player's Handbook and DMG, let them know. Send them my way, and be happy to have new listeners and new DMs in our community. So thank you very much for listening, and I really hope that this was helpful to you. We'll see what I think when I go through and edit it, but yeah, it's, I've been putting this episode off because honestly, I don't know that a podcast is the best way to do this. Maybe like a YouTube video where I could have a screen to show you things might be better, but that's also a lot more involved to produce. But hopefully this is helpful. And I really hope, maybe some of you can just listen to this and grok it, but I suspect that few of you will be able to. Nothing against you. I just think that this is, to just hear it kind of in an abstract way, it's hard to grasp, I think. I think you really got to sit down with it a little bit. But hopefully this discussion, plus what's in the DMG, plus just kind of working through it yourself, hopefully all those together will help you more easily understand this and grasp this, because this is something I've been asked about many, many times. And I really wanted to try to help people figure this out, because it's a little intimidating. Some people, they start seeing numbers and plus signs and minus signs, or any hint of anything math related, and they just kind of switch off and they're like, I don't like math, or I can't do math, or math is hard. And they don't even try. They just assume that it's beyond them, that they can't do it. And there's not one of you out there that I believe for a minute can't grasp this, can't do it. And it's really, I don't think as hard as some of you may think it will be or assume it is. So hopefully, if nothing else, this has shown you that it's not really that bad, even though probably listening to me talk about it, it sounds worse than it is. But it's simple math. It's, there's no calculus or anything involved. So yeah, I think you can do it, and, use a calculator by all means. I do. I mean, it's quicker, it's easier, and more accurate. So, yeah, just sit down with a calculator and a piece of paper and your DMG, and yeah, just create a monster from scratch, or take something like the goblin and just put it through this process. Something simple like a goblin, you'll probably get the CR that they get. The lower CR stuff, the simpler stuff, you pretty much get what they get. It's when you start getting into higher CR things, or like legendary monsters, or monsters that have a lot of different magic abilities and stuff like that. That's when you start getting different numbers than what they get. But even then, I will say it's close. It's usually within 1 or 2 CR of what the published number is. So yeah, you're not going to be way off. You'll be close, definitely good enough for what we need this to do. So, yeah, I hope it's helpful to you. Let me know how I did. And next time we'll go into more detail on creating an entire stat block. This was just kind of the highlights for a quick and dirty monster. But if you really want to flesh out a monster and do everything, that's what we'll talk about next time. And then maybe we'll create an example together with Brett. So if you have any ideas or suggestions for that, let us know. And if one of them really grabs us, maybe that's what we'll do. So also, I'm looking forward to hearing from people what you think about the recap of my campaign. Totally get if you want to wait and hear the first one first and see what you think of it. But hopefully that's something you enjoy as well. I hope that you have a chance to play some D&D this week. I hope you have a chance to run some D&D. I'll be back soon with another episode of Dungeon Master's Journey. Until then, let's create some monsters.
This has been a Starwalker Studios production, your source for quality gaming and hobby podcasts.
This episode's music, courtesy of Cloudwalker, Transboy, Renfield, Stanko, and Ish. See the show notes for more details at starwalkerstudios.com/Game Master's Journey.